Welcome back to the Art of Climate Modeling. In today's lecture, we'll be looking at parameterized processes in global climate modeling systems. These are processes that are not represented in the atmospheric dynamical core, either because they occur on the subgrid scale, such as turbulence or convection, or because they are not related to the dynamics of the atmosphere, for example, moist processes, chemistry, or radiation. This lecture is broken up into two parts. In today's lecture, we'll be tackling the scales of parameterization, parameterizing turbulence, and parameterizing convection and clouds. In the following lecture, we'll be talking about parameterizing microphysics, radiation, and evaluating parameterizations. To begin, let's contextualize this lecture by discussing the scales of parameterizations and the processes parameterizations are designed to capture. Early in this course, we first introduced the concept of discretization. In order to make modeling of the global atmosphere feasible on a computer system, we had to divide the atmosphere into several discrete regions. Within every region, only one value was stored for each of the variables being predicted by the model: pressure, temperature, density, the three components of velocity, and any supplemental quantities like mixing ratios of different chemical species. For CMIP class global Earth system models, typical grid spacing, that is the distance between degrees of freedom, was on the order of 110 kilometers in the horizontal and 100 meters or so in the vertical at the near surface. This process of reducing the complexity of the global atmosphere to only a manageable number of variables was referred to as discretization. As a consequence of this process, we set up an artificial divide between processes and features that are resolved, including those that are at or larger than the grid scale, and those that are unresolved, which includes those that occur on spatial scales below the grid scale. The processes that are unresolved are handled by the model's parameterizations, which are statistical or theoretical approximations to the unresolved processes based on the resolved scale information. The plot here shows atmospheric features in terms of their characteristic length scale along the bottom axis and their characteristic time scale along the left axis. At the top right of this chart, we see planetary scale waves with scales up to the circumference of the planet. Below that are cyclone waves, responsible for extratropical cyclones with a spatial scale of 1,000 to several thousand kilometers and a time scale of days. And then large-scale cloud clusters at scales of around 100 kilometers and several hours. Below that, cumulonimbus convection at a spatial scale of 10 kilometers and a time scale of under an hour. And finally, in the main branch, cumulus convection with spatial scale of a few hundred meters to a few kilometers and time scale of minutes. Also on this diagram, we see microscale turbulence at the left of the diagram, with spatial scales below 200 meters, which is responsible for turbulent mixing of the atmosphere. At the bottom, we see sound waves, which are meteorologically insignificant because of their short time scale, but do span several spatial scales. At the grid spacing of typical CMIP class models, we can resolve features to the right and top of the red box on this diagram. Features within the red box are unresolved and must be parameterized by the model. This includes most cloud clusters, cumulonimbus convection, cumulus convection, and turbulence. Typical high-resolution modeling systems operate at grid spacing of 25 kilometer, or around a quarter of a degree. At these scales, tropical cyclones and cloud clusters can now be represented in the model, but most dynamic processes still need to be parameterized. Models at this resolution can still run with a hydrostatic dynamical core and correctly represent the large-scale dynamics. However, as model grid spacing is reduced to 10 kilometer and more cumulonimbus convection becomes resolved, we reach scales where the hydrostatic approximation no longer holds and the dynamic core must adopt a fully non-hydrostatic equation set. Notably, 10-kilometer grid spacing is also a typical grid spacing of global numerical weather prediction systems. Below these scales, we enter into a regime known as the gray zone, or alternatively, the parameterization no man's land. This is a strange regime for models because some convective processes can be resolved while others are unresolved, depending on the scale of those features. If convection is both resolved and parameterized, then there can be issues with double counting, leading to too much vertical transport in the model. Most modelers generally discourage running models at resolutions in the gray zone because of this issue. If modelers push through the gray zone to a grid spacing of 3 kilometer, cumulonimbus convection becomes explicitly resolved and convection does not need to be parameterized. Models at this scale are typically referred to as cloud resolving models, or CRMs. Recent efforts under the Diamond Initiative, which we touched on briefly in Lecture 7, have led to global operational models being employed at grid spacing in the cloud resolving regime. However, because of the high resolution of these simulations, modeling centers have only been asked to contribute 40-day simulations to the Diamond ensemble. Complete resolution of cumulus convection requires models to be pushed into the large Eddy resolving regime, with grid spacing on the order of hundreds of meters. However, such simulations at global scales are highly experimental at this point, and only achievable for short time periods. The parameterizations employed by CAM are shown in this diagram, along with the order in which they're called relative to the dynamics at the top of the diagram. Following the dynamics, surface fluxes, including friction and fluxes of moisture and energy, are computed. These inform behavior of the atmosphere in the boundary layer, where viscosity and turbulence must be resolved. With low-level turbulence then parameterized, we can simulate shallow convection, which is responsible for the vertical transport of fluid parcels. If convection extends through the whole depth of the troposphere, then the deep convection parameterization is activated. Once the dynamics of subgrid scale convection and turbulence are resolved, then we can calculate the distribution of clouds in the macrophysics parameterization. This information is then passed to the microphysics parameterization, which deals with water species, phase changes of water, condensation, and precipitation. The vertical distribution of moisture species and aerosols in the atmosphere is then used to inform the radiation parameterization, which handles both terrestrial radiation and solar radiation, and the interaction of radiation with the atmosphere. This cycle then represents the full suite of parameterizations typically employed in these global Earth system models. Sometimes information produced by one parameterization is needed by another parameterization, which is represented here by the blue arrows. At a high level, parameterizations follow a few general principles in GCMs that are shown here. First, inputs and effects are totally constrained within single columns. This approximation is generally imposed to simplify both the parameterization and the software engineering involved. It is generally justified because the horizontal scale of grid cells is far larger than the vertical scale of these grid cells. Some newer radiation parameterizations have attempted to incorporate 3D effects to better capture the trajectories of photons, but at present essentially all global atmospheric modeling systems employ only single-column parameterizations. Second, most parameterizations do not have a memory. That is, parameterizations only work on the instantaneous state of the system provided by the dynamics. This approximation assumes the parameterized processes occur on timescales shorter than the timescale of the dynamics, and only react to changes in the large-scale environment. With that said, some modern convection parameterizations do retain information on subgrid scale turbulence, such as eddy kinetic energy. These variables are treated as tracers and can be transported around by the large-scale flow. Third, most parameterizations assume that the spatial and temporal scales are sufficiently large that the flow within a grid box can be modeled statistically. In the case of the turbulence parameterization, this means assuming eddies are far smaller than the grid scale. In the case of the convection parameterization, this means assuming the grid cell is big enough to have multiple convective plumes and associated subsidence regions. And fourth, parameterizations are assumed to be mass, momentum, and energy conserving. Thus, no physical principles are broken when the parameterizations are run. These physical principles may not be baked into the schemes themselves, and so sometimes mass or energy fixers may be needed within the column to fix any problems caused by the parameterizations. Note that as resolution increases and grid spacing becomes smaller, these assumptions underlying 1, 2, and 3 here may no longer hold. 3D physical effects may become relevant. Parameterized processes may not complete within one dynamics time step, and sufficient statistics may not be available within one grid cell. We also have different choices when it comes to how different physical parameterizations are allowed to impact the state of the system. The process split configuration shown in the top is more efficient because all parameterizations can be run in parallel, while the time split configuration shown at the bottom, where parameterizations are run one after another, allows individual parameterizations to more easily conserve mass and energy. These choices are significant, but given the time available, we'll only gloss over them in this lecture. Now that we've motivated parameterizations and discussed some of the principles of their high-level design, let's turn our attention to some simple examples of parameterizations. The first class of parameterization we'll discuss are those that are needed because of the discretization. These kinds of parameterizations capture processes that can shift from unresolved to resolved as model grid spacing is reduced. In this category, the first parameterization we'll discuss is turbulent mixing, which handles exchange of air between adjacent volumes that would not be captured by the large-scale transport. The turbulence parameterization is most important in the boundary layer, where viscous effects become more pronounced because of surface friction. This plot shows a snapshot of a convective boundary layer undergoing turbulent mixing. The turbulent eddies here are typically much smaller in scale than the height of the boundary layer itself, and so are not directly represented in the modeling system. Note that the undulations in the inversion layer caused by convective overshooting from the well-mixed turbulent region can puncture into the stratified layer above. This is potentially the start of a convective plume, which we'll talk about later. To simplify matters, let's first focus on understanding how turbulence affects a simple transport equation, like the water-vapor transport equation. Recall that this equation describes the property of an air parcel that, in the absence of sources and sinks, the mixing ratio of water vapor will be conserved following the parcel. This principle is captured in the Lagrangian form of this equation at the top. Using the material derivative to expand out this equation then yields the Eulerian form. And if we use product rule to combine this form of the equation with the mass continuity equation, we obtain the conservative form of this equation, which relates the time rate of change of the water vapor density to the divergence of the water vapor flux. We'll be working with this last form of the equation because its discrete analog, in the finite volume or finite element context, preserves the principle of conservation of mass. Because horizontal and vertical scales are so disparate in atmospheric models, it's useful for us to separate the terms for horizontal and vertical mass flux. Now recall that parameterizations operate on the subgrid scale or unresolved state of the system. To develop such a parameterization then requires us to separate the subgrid scale from the resolved scale. The mathematical formulation of Reynolds Averaging enables us to do just this. To apply Reynolds Averaging, a given field is written as the sum of a resolved scale variable and an unresolved variable, where we assume the resolved scale variable is an average over the grid box and the unresolved variable represents spatial variation within the grid box. By construction, the average of the unresolved variable is always 0. There are a few properties that then follow. First, it's easy to understand that the average of the average is simply equal to the average, since it has no subgrid scale variation. Second, if we average the product of two variables, we obtain the product of the averages of each variable plus an average of the product of the perturbations. Let's see how Reynolds averaging works out in practice. We'll break up the horizontal velocity, vertical velocity, and water vapor mixing ratio into resolved and unresolved components, but for simplicity assume density is approximately homogeneous. We then substitute these expansions into the transport equation, expand the resulting equation, and simplify using the rules of Reynolds averaging. The result is the equation at the bottom of this slide, which represents a new update equation for the resolved water vapor density. The original equation, which consisted of only 2 terms, has now been expanded into 4 terms. This includes the 2 familiar terms corresponding to large-scale transport of the resolved scale fields, and 2 new terms which represent exchange of mass through subgrid scale or eddy mixing. Notably, we do not have a predictive equation for these subgrid scale terms, and so must develop a theoretical or statistical relationship that allows us to relate the behavior of these terms to the resolved scale flow. To proceed, we'll need to make some simplifying assumptions, since, again, the processes captured by the eddy scale mixing are not in terms of resolved variables. The construction of these assumptions is necessary for us to develop a closed set of equations, but care must be taken to respect the physics of the problem. Generally, these assumptions are based on scale analysis of the underlying problem, or empirical relationships between unknown terms and known terms. In our current problem, we'll leverage the observation that the unresolved horizontal and vertical fluxes are generally comparable in magnitude, but that because of the pancake-like nature of individual grid cells, these vertical fluxes are resolved over much shorter distances than the horizontal fluxes. That is, thinking about the eddy mixing derivative as a finite difference, the numerators of both terms are about the same magnitude, while the denominator of the vertical mixing is much smaller. This means that vertical eddy mixing will tend to be much more important than horizontal mixing. So this simplification allows us to drop one term from our update equation and leaves us with one term that still needs to be parameterized. This singular remaining term then represents unresolved vertical eddy transport. Understanding how the vertical eddy term relates to resolved scale motions requires us to have a strong physical intuition of what this term represents. To better understand what is going on, consider a simplified model of mixing between two grid boxes stacked atop one another. These two grid boxes have different values of the water-vapor mixing ratio, but are subject to mixing along the interface. We assume that there is no bulk vertical motion present. That is, over bar W is 0. If we were to simulate turbulent mixing at very fine grid spacing, we may see something analogous to what is shown in this simulation of a Kelvin-Helmholtz instability. In the mixing process, disturbances along the boundary of these two grid boxes grow and intensify, leading to mixing of the fluid. Observe that along the interface we see the solution turn to gray, indicating that fluid from both the top and bottom are being mixed together to smooth out the sharp gradient that was previously present in the mixing ratio. This suggests that at a macroscopic level, turbulent mixing is having an effect very similar to diffusion. This observation motivates our first parameterization. Given that the vertical eddy transport is representing subgrid scale mixing, and that subgrid scale mixing behaves like diffusion, it makes sense that the eddy flux term can be replaced with a term that looks like a diffusive flux. That is, a term proportional to the derivative of the mixing ratio across the interface. That could simply be equal to negative Ke times the difference in the mixing ratio across the interface, where Ke here is a constant of proportionality that represents the effective viscosity due to eddy mixing. This constant can then be determined by empirical measurement of the strength of mixing in the system. Turbulence parameterizations of this type are referred to as eddy diffusivity or K-theory models. More advanced forms of turbulence can be developed from this starting point. For example, the eddy viscosity term can be related to the properties of the resolved flow, as in the case of the Smagorinsky-Lilly turbulence model, where it is related to the strain tensor, or to the distance away from the surface, as in the case of modeling turbulent boundary layers. More complex parameterizations could involve tracking things like the turbulent kinetic energy, or TKE, which is included as a scalar quantity that is transported by the flow. And to represent even more detail, we can include further predicted variables that capture subgrid scale variability. CAM currently employs one such higher order closure, the cloud layers unified by binormals, or CLUB scheme. Closely related to turbulence parameterization are the convection and cloud macrophysics parameterizations. As with turbulence, these parameterizations are highly sensitive to the model grid spacing, since both convection and clouds can be present in the simulation at or near the grid scale. Because of their potential to behave very differently depending on the resolved scale, care must be taken in their design and employ. In the atmosphere, convection occurs when warmer, less dense fluid finds itself below cooler, more dense fluid. Buoyancy effects draw the cooler, more dense fluid downward, which displaces the warmer fluid upward. In a moist environment, this results in warm air that rises, cools, and produces condensation. Strong thunderstorms produced by buoyancy effects are around 20 kilometers across and develop and dissipate over the course of around 30 minutes. Upward convection of air is compensated for by downward subsidence of air. Because unstable, rising air generally moves much faster than sinking air, mass balance requires that convective regions be much smaller than regions of subsidence. This means that a single grid cell with 100 kilometers to a side will contain several convective plumes of varying height and large regions of subsiding air. Most convective parameterizations require that the grid box be large enough to represent both the convecting plume and the subsidence region. This motivates a fundamental assumption of convective parameterizations first stated by Arakawa and Schubert in their famous 1974 paper, where they describe the foundations of their convective parameterization. Namely, consider a horizontal area large enough to contain an ensemble of cumulus clouds, but small enough to cover only a fraction of a large-scale disturbance. The existence of such an area is one of the basic assumptions of this paper. When the grid spacing becomes too small for this assumption to hold, traditional convective parameterizations can no longer be employed, and we must transition to more advanced schemes, or fully resolve the dynamic convection. One such example of a convective parameterization is the Zhang-McFarlane deep convection scheme employed in CAM. Under this scheme, it is assumed that the grid cell contains an ensemble of convective scale updrafts within each cell, along with associated saturated downdrafts. These updrafts are assumed to exist whenever the atmosphere is conditionally unstable in the lower troposphere. Moist convection then occurs when convective available potential energy, or CAPE, is present, which is computed from the resolved scale fields. As with most convective schemes, the assumptions underlying the Zhang-McFarlane scheme are no longer satisfied at finer grid scales. At grid spacing of 14 km and below, it's typical to disable this scheme to avoid potential double counting of resolved and parameterized convection. Further, it's generally found models tend to produce more realistic results when grid spacing is below 14 km and deep convection is disabled. Convective parameterizations are closely tied to convective clouds such as cumulus or cumulonimbus clouds, since both are associated with convecting air that triggers condensation. Around these convective plumes, several processes must be considered, including turbulence in the boundary layer, lateral and cloud top entrainment of environmental air into the plume, and detrainment of air from the plume into the environment. We've already discussed the turbulence parameterization in the previous section, but what about entrainment? Put simply, entrainment refers to the active annexation of environmental air by turbulence. The mixing of air within a convective plume and the surrounding environment can occur on both fine and coarse scales, making it very difficult to parameterize. Entrainment is also fundamental in defining the characteristics of the convective plume, and so important in determining the character of the resulting cloud. Because of this, quantities like climate sensitivity in climate modeling systems are highly sensitive to the value of the parameters governing entrainment. And so advanced convective parameterization remain a hot topic of ongoing research. Much like turbulence, convection is an inherently stabilizing process which causes mixing of air in different layers of the atmosphere. In this sense, convection is a form of vertical diffusion, since it is responsible for vertical mixing. However, unlike turbulence, it can occur over large vertical scales, which requires the parameterization to account for the full structure of the vertical column. Generally, convective parameterizations are responsible for three decisions. First, they must choose when convection is present at the subgrid scale using resolved scale information. Second, they need to determine the intensity or height of each plume, namely whether or not the column will produce shallow or deep convection. And third, they need to then evolve the vertical distribution of the plume to account for entrainment, convective adjustment, and buoyancy effects. Differences in convective parameterizations can generally be traced back to different formulations employed for each of these three factors. Boundary layer and convective parameterizations are closely entwined with the cloud macrophysics, since shallow and deep convection are responsible for the generation of cumulus and cumulonimbus clouds. As a result, convective parameterizations are required to correctly model tropical meteorology, which is dominated by deep convective plumes and cumulonimbus towers. Further, convective parameterizations are responsible for capturing high-impact weather systems like mesoscale convective systems, which are responsible for extreme precipitation throughout the U.S. Great Plains and East. Convective clouds and macrophysics schemes are largely a product of the shallow and deep convective parameterizations, as convective plumes are generally far into the subgrid scale. Stratiform clouds are another type of cloud produced by macrophysics parameterizations, but not as a product of the convection scheme. In the real world, stratiform clouds form when relative humidity reaches 100%, leading to saturation of the air and subsequent condensation. This topic is discussed in detail in the lectures 10 and 11 from our Changing Atmosphere lecture series. However, things are different in the discrete world. Given that the relative humidity computed in a grid cell represents an average over that whole grid cell, even a grid average relative humidity of 70% could be indicative of an environment where small-scale pockets of clouds are possible. Thus, these cloud parameterizations typically allow cloud fraction to increase from 0% cloud at 70% relative humidity to 100% cloud at 100% relative humidity, with some appropriately chosen function in between. However, the multi-scale nature of clouds in global atmospheric models makes simulating them one of the greatest challenges for models. We already mentioned some of the issues related to convective clouds, including the simulation of lateral and cloud top entrainment. However, other cloud types are equally, if not more challenging. Even non-convective clouds pose challenges for models. Stratiform clouds can be generated as the product of convective detrainment, frontal lifting, and orographic lifting. They have a particularly pronounced effect on climate, as they cover about 34% of the ocean and 18% of the land surface at any given time. Nonetheless, these clouds rarely occur with the right frequency in climate modeling systems. The right image provides a qualitative explanation for why this is the case. Note the regions of relatively dense clouds and high albedo, and regions of sparse clouds with low albedo. Capturing this subtle divide between clear sky and cloudy sky is a challenging matter, since the character of the clouds is highly dependent on the local environment. At a small grid spacing, the basic assumptions of our macrophysics parameterizations also need to be reevaluated. While a cumulus cloud of 1 kilometer may only occupy a small part of a grid cell when that grid cell is 100 kilometers across, if the grid spacing is 1 kilometer, then the single cumulus cloud would occupy the whole cell. In the left image, we see cloud fractions that can vary from 0 to 1 depending on the relative humidity of the environment, while in the right image, at small grid spacing, cells essentially have a cloud fraction of either 0 or 1. This has motivated the development of cloud parameterizations that work, regardless of the grid scale of the underlying model. Given the inherent difficulties in formulating cloud and convective parameterizations, innovations have been sought that sidestep the issue entirely. Super-Parameterizations are one such approach, constructed by replacing the parameterization with a fine-scale large eddy model that can resolve convective plumes and cloud clusters. The embedded models have periodic boundary conditions and consist of either 1 or 2 stacked 2D XZ models. This makes them cheaper to run than high-resolution models with a comparable number of degrees of freedom, and makes them highly parallelizable on GPUs and other vector computing systems. While super-parameterizations are still sometimes hundreds of times slower than traditional parameterizations, super-parameterized models can simulate convective and cloud processes where traditionally parameterized models continue to struggle. Okay, that's enough of our quick dive into parameterizations. In the next lecture, we'll continue these discussions by addressing parameterizations that need to be included regardless of the grid scale, including microphysics and radiation. And then we'll wrap things up with a discussion on parameterization evaluation.